Yep. Okay, let's go. Dear friends, we will start our presentation of Mazeppa's Gospel. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of my editor of Arabic text, Abuna Ibrahim Khares, first of all. And also I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to Ioanna Feodorou. She inspired me to start this research, and she proposed to create a full list of findings, first Arabic printed books. He did fantastic work on Romanian contribution to Arabic printing. And I followed Ioanna Feodorou, and also was looking for Mazeppa's Gospel in Lebanon for 4 years. And totally we found 24 Aleppo printings, 24 books from Aleppo, 1706, 1711, printed 1706, 1711. And the last finding, actually it's 25th, now it's in my hand, I'll try to show you. Like this. And it is, you can get, it is second edition of Gospel Aprakos, printed in Aleppo, and there is no first page and introductory part of this Gospel, but it is an edition which consists of 560 pages, and size and the 21 line on page show us that it is an edition of 1708, and it is also a part of Ukrainian contribution made by Ukrainian nobleman, Ukrainian colonel Danilo Apostol. There are also the images of two evangelists in this book. I'll just show you one. It's St. Matthew, just like this, yes? Okay. Today, two copies of Mazeppa's Gospel are kept abroad in the library of the Romanian Academy of Sciences and in the Russian National Library. In 1925, Serhiy Maslov, Ukrainian researcher, described the third Kyiv copy of Gospel that remained in the library of Kyiv Theological Academy under the code B16. And then in 1925, this Gospel was transferred to the National Library of Ukraine in Kyiv. Today it's Vernadsky National Library of Ukraine. Serhiy Maslov's book also was described in Salavil article Bibliographie Ukrainienne, not bibliographique. However, in the modern scientific literature, researchers of Arabic printing mention only the Bucharest and St. Petersburg copies. Using the description of Serhiy Maslov and the catalog of the Library of Kyiv Theological Academy, we searched long time and found the Gospel in the Department of Library Collections and Historical Collections in Vernadsky National Library of Ukraine. And in cooperation with Vernadsky National Library of Ukraine and Memorial Fund for His Beatitude Metropolitan Volodymyr, the Embassy of Ukraine in Lebanon published a facsimile edition of Mazeppa's Gospel. We presented the edition in Kyiv, in St. Sophia Cathedral Church, in Baturin, Mazeppa's capital and residence, and after 313 years, the Gospel finally reached the city of destination, Baturin. In Lebanon, we presented the Gospel also to the President of Lebanese Republic, Prime Minister, and many libraries and universities in Lebanon. Ahatanhel Krymskyi pays much attention to Arabic Halep Gospel of 1708, and he wrote, in the early 1700s, the newly founded Halep printing house published sacred books, among which the Gospel 1708 has a certain indication that it was printed at the expense of the glorious Hetman Ivan Mazepa. And the researcher also gives the sources where Mazepa Gospel was described. Very important. Can we put also pictures now? Just. Mazepa was a ruler of Ukraine, Cossack Ukraine. For 22 years, from 1687 to 1709. It was one of the most prominent Ukrainian leaders. And very important part of this edition is an introductory part, and introductory remarks written by Patriarch Athanasius the Best III, and second page with image of coat d'arms of Ivan Mazepa. You can see it, the Christ inside with letter of V on top. Athanasius the Best's appreciation expressed in Greek, one page on the right side now, and Arabic, 5 pages. The Greek part of this appreciation, we call it panegyric from Greece, made in the shape of Mazepa's coat d'arms. You can see V on top, and you can see the Christ of Ivan Mazepa. It is very interesting that Maslow notes in his article that he was assisted, that Ahatanhel Krymskyi personally assisted in the translation by Krymsky's students, Loziev and Kezma. And the translation was checked, sorry, I made a mistake. Maslow explained the translation of this book for his publication, and it was done by Ahatanhel Krymskyi and his friends Loziev and Kezma. Therefore, we can say that Krymskyi participated in the research of Kiev copy of Mazepa Gospel. The question arises, why in the 3rd chapter of History of New Arabic Literature he provides the information only about St. Petersburg copy and does not mention about the Kiev one? Here we may only assume that the text of the 3rd chapter of the book he wrote before 1925, and his plans for general editing of the text before publication unfortunately did not materialize. Now, next page, please. Now, there is a very controversial issues related to Aleppo early printed books in the issue of font authorships. As we know, Ioanna Feodorov wrote about 3 versions of this fonts, this authorship of fonts, and we also managed to review, and maybe she will also speak about it. We managed to review the originals of 24 important for comparison Aleppo editions found in Lebanon and 1 found in Kiev, as well as we make some preliminary conclusions about the font features of these early printed books. We compared the first edition in Aleppo, the Psalms of 1708, with the Liturgicon of 1701 and Chronologion of 1702, printed in Snago and Bucharest by Antiem Iverianu. We also compared fonts of the Psalms of 1706 and the book Mezanet Zaman, first published in the printing house of the monastery of St. John at Shuair, Hinshara, in 1734. Those comparisons allow us to state that the font of the Psalms is much closer to the font produced by Abdullah Zahir and his new printing house in Shuair, and that both fonts are most likely made by a Lebanese first typographer printer, Abdullah Zahir. Despite his young age, in 1706, Zahir was 22. Also, according to another version, 26. But he seems to have been a very talented jeweler and engraver and was able to quickly master the production of fonts. And on the material of Aleppo and Shuair editions, one can trace the peculiar evolution of the young master who was constantly improving his fonts. Finally, I'd like once again to express my gratitude to fantastic team who did this fantastic book. First of all, it's a team of the Embassy of Ukraine. In Lebanon, it's my wife, Maryna Hrymych, Andriy Kornichuk, Tamara Rakhnyanska. It is translator Vasim Dalul. Once again, I'd like to acknowledge fantastic work of Father Ibrahim Hared. It was great cooperation. Thank you very much. And also Abuna Bulos Nazha from Hinshara. It was a fantastic team. And one more man who also was assisted us very seriously. It is man who represents the family of Mikhail Naime. His name is Najib Naime. And I'd like to now to present this gospel to the library of the family of Naime. And it is one more connection, one more ties between Ukraine and Lebanon, because Mikhail Naime, from 1706, almost the same time, 1906 till 1911, studied in Ukraine, in Poltava, and his first poetry was written in Poltava, in Ukraine. And he fell in love with Barbara, which also was Ukrainian woman, and it was the best, it was real love of his life, I can say. Okay, I'd like to invite my friend Najib Naime, and I'd like to present him this book to the Library of Family of Mikhail Naime. Okay. Okay, maybe I should pass the ground, the micro to my colleague, diplomat, who today represents the Embassy of Romania, and he will explain why he is here. Please, the floor is yours.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for having me here. My name is Adrian Lărgeanu, Deputy Head of Mission at the Romanian Embassy. Doamna Feodorov, mă bucur să vă văd și să vă salut. Your Excellency, congratulations for this event, which highlights the cultural relations between Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Of course, at the same time, the intense cultural activity of Mazepa provides the opportunity to bring forward the good relations between the Ukrainian and the Romanian people throughout history. In this particular case, between Hetman Ivan Mazepa and Constantin Brâncoveanu, a very important ruler in the Romanian history, Prince of Wallachia between 1688 and 1714. Brâncoveanu was a great patron of culture, his achievements being part of the Romanian and world cultural heritage. And if I'm not mistaken, and I hope I'm not, the Gospel of Mazepa was printed in 1708 in Aleppo using a printing press that was sent by Brâncoveanu in 1706. I hope I'm right. So anyway, all in all, Your Excellency, and without wanting to go too deep into historical facts that I'm not specialized in, congratulations for the idea and the thorough work behind this event, and also for the opportunity to put under the spotlight the cultural connections between our countries and our regions with the Arab world. Thank you. Congratulations.
Okay, and now it's a great pleasure for me to give the floor to fantastic researcher from Romania. Actually, you introduced, you are representing Romania here. It is Ioana Feodorou, which really, as I mentioned, inspired me to make this very serious academic work, very serious endeavor. And Ioana Feodorou, the floor is yours, please.
شكرا جزيلا لهذه الدعوة الكريمة. يسرني كثيرا، هذا شرف عظيم أن أتكلم اليوم أمامكم جميعا من بوخارست. Now, as the AUB host, will kindly allow me to share my presentation with you, I hope. Let's see if that works. So, you see my title, I hope?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. I shall begin by saying that I'm grateful to His Excellency Ambassador Ihor Ostash for the splendid facility that he accomplished and for inviting me here today. I have timed my speech, so in principle I shouldn't speak more than 14 minutes, but if you will allow me at the end one phrase about the technical, quite difficult issue of the fonts, of the types that His Excellency invoked, and they deserve at least one phrase which was not in my original intentions. I would like to speak about the cultural connections that printing Arabic books created between the Christians of the Romanian principalities, Ukraine, and Syria and Lebanon in the 18th century. Printing in their own language was a major objective for the Arabic-speaking Christians of the Ottoman provinces, particularly from the second half of the 17th century on. I hope you are seeing the map. If someone could confirm to me that you're seeing my map?
Yes, yes.
Yes, thank you. Patriarchs of the Church of Antioch set this goal for themselves as part of their mission to aid the spiritual and social progress of their communities. Athanasius the Abbas, who served twice as patriarch, intermittently resided in Wallachia in 1698 to 1704, looking for political and financial support for his church. The Romanian's connection to printing in Arabic started at the time the Abbas was in Bucharest, a difficult time for the Eastern churches under Ottoman rule since 1516. The Abbas asserted in the foreword to the Psalter that he printed in 1706 at Aleppo, and I quote, "Brothers of the faith in the Arab lands who kept their devotion were weakened by the subjection and the violence to which they were coerced by the Ottomans," end of quote. The Abbas first arrived in Bucharest in March 1700. In September 1702, Constantin Brâncoveanu, the Prince of Wallachia, signed a deed granting the Patriarchate of Antioch $500 per year to be collected by the Patriarch's envoy from the princely salt mines on the feast of St. Demetrius, October the 26th. His reason, as given in the donation act, was, and I quote, "Hearing that this saintly and holy Patriarchate of Antioch is weakened and without an income, and seeing that His Holiness Father Athanasius, who was the Patriarch of this holy church, came and brought blessing and prayer to us, asking us to support and to give something to this holy Patriarchate from our gains, we did this charitable deed towards the Patriarchate so that it remains firm, unwavering, and untouched as long as my Lordship lives." End of quote. Although subjected to the Ottoman pressure in a different way, Romanians and Arabic-speaking Christians experienced the same troubles and aspirations. In cultural terms, the devout of the Patriarchate of Antioch aspired since the 16th century to replace the church languages, Syriac and Greek, with the vernacular one, as a deliberate acknowledgement of their Arab spirit. At the same time, Romanians were striving to achieve a definitive transfer from Church Slavonic and Greek to the Romanian vernacular. They had already replaced the faulty old manuscripts of the Holy Scriptures with unified printed versions based on reliable translations of Greek texts. As reported in a foreword, the Abbas had addressed Brâncoveanu thus, and I quote, "Priests in Syria are indigent and poor in many places. They hardly have what they need for their subsistence. They cannot properly serve the divine liturgy, for Arabic books available only in manuscript are very expensive." End of quote. He also offered other good reasons, similar to those of the European promoters of printing. Manuscript copies of the Holy Scriptures were filled with grammatical errors, the texts were altered from one copy to the other, and their quality depended on the copy's degree of education. A beautiful portrait of Athanasius Dabas, written soon after his death in 1724, was included by Radu Popescu, Chancellor of the Court, in his History of the Princes of Wallachia. And I quote, "Athanasius was a man of God. He was good, kind, modest. He kept away from all sin to the point that he surpassed in selflessness all I ever met. He also prepared Orthodox church books in Arabic types, which he printed here in our country, and then His Holiness took them to the lands of Antioch. And when he distributed them to the churches, they were all filled with joy, thanking His Holiness, for they had never seen such a thing." End of quote. To help the Abbas print in Arabic, Brâncoveanu appointed Antimi Vireanu, the Georgian, his most gifted printer and the future Metropolitan of Umbro-Wallachia. A skilled master of engraving, Antim was abbot of the Snagov Monastery near Bucharest. He headed the printing house there between 1696 and 1705, when he left for Hrymych following his election as a bishop. He continued to print, and thus his production amounted to 59 books that he edited, 38 printed by himself, 22 in Romanian, 4 his own compositions, 27 in Greek and Romanian, 8 in Slavonic and Romanian, and 2 in Greek and Arabic. These books were intended both for the clergy and the common folk. They were readable and low-priced. In 1716, for purely political reasons, he was martyred in Constantinople 2 years after Constantin Brâncoveanu and 4 of his sons had met the same fate. Assisted by the Abbas, Antim carved and cut the punches for Arabic types by the same technique that is documented for his Greek and Cyrillic types. He first used them in printing in 1701 at Snagov a book of the Divine Liturgies. This book had a tremendous impact on liturgical culture, as Cyril Sharon remarked. This version would be reprinted again and again until 1839. There followed in 1702, at the Princely Press of Bucharest, a substantial book of hours of 731 pages. Icons, decorative borders, and floral elements were added as customary in books printed in Romanian presses at the time. As to the costs, in his dedication to Brâncoveanu in the first book, Athanasius stated that the Arabic types were manufactured, I quote, at the order and the expense of the most faithful, most enlightened, and most gentle Lord and Master of all Uncrovalatia, Kir Constantin Basarab, Voivod, Avlad Brâncoveanu, who graciously inquired about the misery of the Antiochian Christians and had the charitable thought of having their service books printed in Arabic to be freely distributed to all priests in his name. End of quote. Later in his foreword to the history of the Patriarchs of Antioch, a Greek chronicle presented to the Wallachian prince while at court, the Abbas recollects the useful new Arabic types that he had ordered for the benefit of the Antiochian Christians, and Brâncoveanu's financial contribution to these books. This style of eulogy would later be used in the praise to Hetman Mazepa, another illustrious supporter of the Abbas's printing projects. When leaving Bucharest in 1704, the Abbas received from Antim as a gift the Arabic types and wooden blocks for page ornaments present in Antim's books and the first books of Aleppo alike. The Snagov press never produced Arabic books again, whereas the Abbas installed a workshop at the bishopric in Aleppo, and there 9 books were printed in Arabic between 1706 and 1711 with Arabic types, some with second editions. The first book of Aleppo, ready in 1706, was the Psalter, with Brâncoveanu's coat of arms on the second page. This Psalter would be reprinted in Beirut in 1752, with interesting features connecting it to the Abbas's press, which I have already presented in an article. In 1706 were also successively printed the Arabic Gospels, and the commented version of them, a kind of lectionary with a double number of pages and icons of the 4 evangelists, later reprinted at the expense of Hetman Daniel Apostol. This is the book that His Excellency kindly showed to us earlier. In 1708, a second edition of the Gospels was printed again at the expense of the most noble Ivan Mazepa the Hetman, as the title page goes. This volume includes a new foreword dedicated to Mazepa with a eulogy in Greek and Arabic verse. Ivan Stepanovich Mazepa, Hetman of the Cossacks, was presented to Athanasius the Abbas as a potential supporter of the Antiochian Christians by Constantin Brâncoveanu himself. Based on the model of books printed in Eastern European presses, the book begins with Hetman Mazepa's coat of arms, which any visitor of the beautiful capital of Ukraine, Kiev, can see on the Mazepa gate of Lavra Pecherska, the monastery of the caves. Incidentally, this desire to leave behind splendid architectural structures as well as printed books was a common feature of Hetman Mazepa and Antim the Iberian, who built a church within a monastery in Bucharest with carved stone ornaments and a templon that copied the artistic elements engraved by Antim in his liturgical books. Except for the frontispiece and the introductory text, which differ, the rest of the book is identical. It is likely that the sheets dated from 1706 and 2 years later, there were sheets left that needed binding and covers to be distributed to the local clergy. Thus, the beautiful aspect of the page, printed in red and black ink, and ornamental elements obtained with tools from Antim's press are perfectly preserved. The Romanian Academy Library owns 1 copy of the 1708 Aleppo Gospels, locally bound in beautiful leather covers, and both
Feodorov from Bucharest, but unfortunately, maybe it's like fate. I don't know. Finally, I checked the Kiev library and discovered this fantastic. I found this fantastic book in Kiev. Now we have Kiev version, Kiev Gospel of Ivan Mazepa, and I'm really proud that today we have this fantastic connection. Lebanon, Levant at all, Ukraine, Romania, and Adrian Lagerianu, which my deputy head of Romanian mission, our friend, and we really will continue this fantastic work. And there are some plans with American University of Beirut, and I hope it will materialize in some great printings again. If you have some questions, we have time for questions. Yes, we are ready to take a couple of questions. Ну, а слово коротеньке з місця можемо дати просто коротенько. Okay, it looks like everything is okay. I'd like to once again to thank Abuna Ibrahim Kharas for his fantastic work. He represents Balamand, a very important center of conservation of manuscripts in Balamand, the Balamand Monastery. We are planning to go with our presentation also to Balamand. Maybe also we'll ask Ioana Feodorov to join us in that fantastic journey, fantastic event it's north of Lebanon, but it's still very warm. Today we have like 26, 27? Abuna, 27. It's okay. Okay, once again, I'd like to express my gratitude to Bilal Orfali, to Oksana Prokhorovich, to my friend Adrian, Romanian Embassy, and of course, Najib Nouaime. Thank you very much, and I'd like to pass the micro to Oksana. She will... Okay, applause.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. So we can continue our event, and we can start the second panel of the conference, which is entitled Historical and Cultural Insights about Lebanon in Ahatanhel Krymskyi's works. Which means that we will look closer to the Lebanese history, to Lebanese colloquial Arabic, and even to Lebanese cinema through the lens of Ahatanhel Krymskyi's fictional works, archives, and letters. And our first speaker is Maryna Hrymych. She holds a Ph.D. in Philology, Ph.D. in History. She is a full professor and a spouse of ambassador of Ukraine to Lebanon. Her primary area of interest was related to Ukrainian traditional culture, and was the secondary interest in traditional forms of communication, interreligious relationships, and everyday diplomacy in multicultural environment. Maryna Hrymych has a... Oh. Maryna Hrymych has a rich experience as a field worker. She worked not only in Ukraine but also in Canada, Brazil, and Lebanon. And today she will present her paper on the personality of fieldwork researcher in Beirut, stories by Ahatanhel Krymskyi.
Your Excellencies, Your Reverences, dear colleagues, let me first of all take the opportunity to express my gratitude to the institutions and people who made this event happen. I would like to thank to American University of Beirut, Department of Arabic and Near East Languages, to Sheikh Zayed Chair for Arabic and Islam Studies, Dr. Bilal Orfali, to Ahatanhel Krymskyi Institute of Oriental Studies, and for this project, Ahatanhel Krymskyi conference. with the thank you for your cooperation with Embassy of Ukraine in Lebanon. My personal gratitude to Oksana Prokhorovich, young but already prominent translator, academician, and as we see, manager of academic events. Oksana Prokhorovich literally made this conference by her hands. And did you sleep this night? Not? Oh. Okay. Also, I would like to thank to my diplomatic colleagues, Andrei Korneychuk and Tamara Rakhnyanska, and of course to Imadedin Raef, who discovered the name of Ahatanhel Krymskyi for Lebanon. And thank you all, and let me present my modest paper, modest in terms of what Professor Ioanna Feodorov presented us before. Today my presentation is very modest, but it reflects my vision as anthropologist and as field worker of Beirut stories by Ahatanhel Krymskyi. So the personality of fieldwork researcher in Beirut stories by Ahatanhel Krymskyi. And now we will share our screen and start our presentation. Я буду, може, це чи сюди натискати цей? Це краще. Okay. Today, such a research strategy as transdisciplinarity and related phenomena, multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, are becoming common research practice. However, at the beginning of the 20th century, one could count on the fingers of one hand these scholars who can easily manage it. Ahatanhel Krymskyi is known not only as academician to be successful in various research disciplines, not only as an excellent manager of science, but also as a writer and poet. His Lebanese period of life was extremely fruitful. By convention, we include to Ahatanhel Krymskyi's Lebanese holdings, Beirut Stories, prose book, Palm Tree Branches, poetry collection, some scientific works, for example, unpublished materials for study of the language and everyday life in Syria, and papers on Oriental history, papers on Oriental history, literature, and ethnography, and very rich correspondence which is written in the genre of research diary. And this part of his legacy has been thoroughly studied by the several generations of scientists, representatives of various disciplines, who have found in it their own research interest. In my report, I would like to trace away the personality of a fieldwork multidisciplinary researcher of Lebanese folk culture appears in Beirut Stories. The author's presence in the text is shown not only through the personage of an eccentric Muscovite who came to Lebanon to study Arabic, but also through the massive anthropological narrative, which often overshades the plot and a bunch of personages. This narrative is based on Ahatanhel Krymskyi's experience as fieldworker, who used in his research investigations a method of included observation. This narrative consists of folklore, language, ethnographic data, and it doesn't play a role of a backstage or decorations as it's supposed to be in the fiction book, but appears as a co-actor of the plot. At least the reader can't shake the feeling that all the anthropological details are no less important than storylines. One day in the life of a boy, a Christmas Orthodox party, a visit to a Beirut doctor, and personages. Hakim Hediye, his wife Hediyeha, Sheikh Jamel, little Elian, Russian school teachers. It should be taken into account that in Lebanon, Krymskyi was a foreigner, using modern terminology and expat. Ethnographers, folklorists, linguists, and anthropologists collect primary field material abroad in a completely different way than they do it in a familiar cultural environment. A field researcher in a foreign field has to break his or her research habits acquired at home and change a research strategy. In Ukraine, the favorite method of collecting folklore and ethnographic material for Krymskyi will be correspondence. Naturally, during his research trip to Lebanon, he couldn't use it. A short explanation: while using correspondence method, a scholar would create a methodology of her or his research, such as questionnaires, programs, recommendations, but those who would collect the actual data are not scholars. It's worth mentioning that the correspondence method is known in British anthropology since Victorian times, when two figures, fieldwork researcher and theoretician, were brought together. In Ukraine, this method turned to be short-lived and situational. The most instrumental and functional fieldwork method for a person working abroad is a method of observation, and if you are lucky, the method of included observation, as we call it in Slavic languages, or participant observation method, as it been used in American or terminology. While the method of interviewing, because of the language barrier, remains often technical and not always effective. Krymskyi lived within community. Oh, тут не зробила transition. Okay. Krymskyi lived within the community of native speakers and culture bearers, so we can state that he successfully and flawlessly used this method. The reader of the Beirut stories not acquainted with Krymskyi, the reader of Beirut stories not acquainted with the Krymskyi's epistolary will not guess that the author incorporated to the plot the image of himself. He appears in the story Sheikh Jamel as a nameless Muscovy. He is the object of gossips, of ghosts and guests sitting at the festive table. This strange man came to Lebanon to learn Arabic. Although Orthodox, he doesn't attend a church, but while the service is going on, walks in the garden and eats oranges and reads books. Muscovite does not fast, and moreover persuades the hostess of the home to do the same as him, because diet is harmful to her health. As an Orthodox, he doesn't learn Arabic from Arabic Christian books, but memorizes Quran. He also recites 1001 nights, which, according to the righteous Orthodox Arabs, contains only debauchery. We also learn about the schedule of the Muscovite researcher. He works at night, goes to bed 3 hours before sunrise, and gets up 5 hours after sunrise. Everything is not as it should be. It's quotation. For anthropologists, the Beirut stories is a kind of workshop on interreligious communication and daily people's diplomacy in Lebanon. And for linguists, it is a detailed onomastic source related to the different self-identifications. Researchers have repeatedly written that Ahatanhel Krymskyi in his Beirut stories showed that religious self-identification prevailed in Lebanon at that time. This statement, although not false, but is very schematic and one-sided. It doesn't reflect the Lebanese reality as it uses the patterns of the European mentality, European lenses. Ahatanhel Krymskyi avoids such a straightforward approach to Oriental realities. As a thoughtful observer, he noticed that the identity in Lebanese society of that historical period is situational. Depending on a context, the person could identify him or herself according to the religious, local, social, or ethnic identity. For example, the word Orthodox means not only the denomination, but culture and social and political circle, and even locality, as for example, person from Ashrafia in Beirut or from Dhuhr Shweir. Beirut stories contain the arsenal of onomastic terminology by the help of which the author denotes different identities of Lebanese society through the lenses of anthropology of religion, as we would say today. He works with the official and folk and the colloquial terms, Orthodox, Rooms, in the meaning of Orthodox, Greeks, Hellenes in the same meaning, even situationally, Al-Sham, old people, exiled grandfathers who migrated from Damascus after the massacre of 1861. By the way, with the term Greek, Beirut people at the end of 19th century in their oral speech marked also Russians who lived there. Russian expats were also named as Moscovs, Muscovites. Catholics of Beirut were called as Jesuits in case they were teachers at the Catholic schools, Frangia, etc. The street life in Beirut at that time was a space for interreligious and inter-ethnic communication and a ground for implementation of everyday diplomacy. As I said, identity in the Middle East is situational. Within each denomination, there was a stratification on a local basis, communal, social, or colloquial dialect. Krymskyi accurately demonstrates the differences between the Beirut and the Mountain Orthodox, who are clearly aware of their otherness. A reader of Beirut stories also notices that Krymskyi distinguishes Arabized Greeks, again Orthodox, and other Levantines. The author writes that ethnic Greeks, in the text they are named as real Greeks, call Orthodox Arabs as Greeks foreign speakers, греки чужомовці, and even Orthodox French nuns come from Marseille are also called Greeks. Krymskyi depicts in his Beirut stories the old-fashioned figure of Sheikh Jamal, who came from the mountains to his Orthodox Beirut relatives, who had already Beirutized, although not lost their Damascus accent. This Jamel у нього, with his Semitic appearance, the author writes, is perceived in Beirut worse than ideologically hostile but close in everyday culture and values Jesuit Catholics, Frangiers or French Beirutians. The moral depravity, as Jamel imagines it, in fact, is a conflict between local identities within a single religious denomination. Similarly, instead of respecting the language of the citadel of Orthodoxy, Russia, parents of the students of Al-Ihsan Orthodox School, sponsored by Russian Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society, insist on teaching their children in French. As a matter of fact, this Catholic language was prestigious and utilitarian in Beirut at that time, and even the dedication to orthodoxy couldn't change parents' minds. And this is another exotic category of Lebanese Orthodox Christians, French-speaking Orthodox Arabs. Ahatanhel Krymskyi was a champion in capturing everything around himself, especially in terms of language and everyday culture. Today, such a research approach is sometimes called as inventory method or cultural inventory of assets. He methodically incorporated his own observations on Beirut realities into the plot of his book Beirut Stories, focusing on communication patterns, culture peculiarities, colloquial peculiarities. He managed to portray relations within the extremely colorful in terms of ethnicity, dialect, and religion Lebanese society, or at the end of 19th and on the edge of 20th century. I will stress that he demonstrates himself as a skillful field worker, namely in the sphere of onomastics. He has carefully recorded all the colloquial and official naming terms by those enriching onomastics associated with the anthropology of religion and identity construction in the Middle East at that time. Therefore, today we consider Beirut Stories not only a fiction text, but also as a rich scientific source. Thank you, and thank you. Slides go. I used templates of slides go for this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Okay, and now I'm glad to introduce you our next participants. There are two scholars who will present their research, Yulia Petrova and Oleksiy Khamray. Yulia Petrova holds Ph.D. in Philology. She is a senior researcher at the Near and Middle East Department at Ahatanhel Krymskyi Institute of Oriental Studies at National Academy of Science of Ukraine. Her primary area of interest was related to Arabic social linguistics and dialects, and she wrote a monograph on Egyptian Arabic. And currently she is interested in exploring Arab Christian heritage and textual criticism of Arabic Christian manuscripts. And as for Oleksiy Khamray, he is Doctor of Science in Philology, head of Near and Middle East Department at Ahatanhel Krymskyi Institute of Oriental Studies. He holds his PhD in Philology for a thesis entitled Formalized Analysis of Hebrew Scripts, and PhD for a thesis entitled Structural Constraints of Arabic Grammar. He is interested in grammar theory, formal languages, Semitology, and the Arabic language. I'm very glad to invite them, and especially glad to see Oleksiy Khamray because he was my professor at Kyiv National University. So I'm happy to welcome you today at our conference, and you can start. I think Yulia starts. Okay.
Just tell me if you see my presentation.
No, not yet.
Is it okay?
Oh, yes.
أنا أريد أن أقدم هذه الورقة بالعربية إذا سمحتم. فقد ذكر اليوم دور كريمسكي البارز في جمع ودراسة التراث العربي الشعبي، ويجب التشديد على أنه أحد الرواد في هذا المجال على المستوى العالمي وخاصة في مجال دراسة اللهجات العربية. والآن سأتطرق إلى موضوع مجموعة الأمثال الشعبية التي جمعها أثناء تواجده في لبنان. وهذه المجموعة تحفظ في الأرشيف في معهد المخطوطات التابعة لمكتبة كريمسكي الوطنية الأوكرانية. فهذا ملف ضخم، نرى على الصورة يعني نموذج من هذه الدفاتر ضمن هذا الملف، ملف ضخم يتضمن 495 ورقة، معظمها عبارة عن مدونات ودفاتر بخط يد كريمسكي، وبعضها أوراق مطبوعة على الآلة الكاتبة. أشار كريمسكي في أحد هذه الدفاتر أنه حرفيا جمع هذه الأمثال منذ الأيام الأولى من تواجده في لبنان، حيث وصل في خريف عام 1896. وكما يبدو المصدر الأساسي لهذه الأمثال كان أهل لبنان، وذكر بشكل خاص على خلاف أحد الدفاتر ما يلي: بعض الأمثال أتى بها عيسى داود المعلم من سوق الغرب، ولكنها كلها معروفة في بيروت أيضا، فدونتها بالطريقة البيروتية وليس حسب النطق الجبري. كان الباحث في سياق اهتمامه بدراسة اللهجات العربية والتراث العربي الشعبي يولي أهمية خاصة لنشر هذا التراث، لذلك بدأ يعمل على إعداد ما قد جمعه من الأمثال اللبنانية للنشر وعيد عودته إلى الموصل، حيث كان يشغل منصب أستاذ اللغة العربية في معهد لازاريف للغات الشرقية. وبحسب شهادته في إحدى رسائله إلى الأكاديمي كريمسكي نعرف أنه كان قد جمع أكثر من 5000 مثل لبناني، وقد قسمها إلى 17 قسما بناء على مواضيع إثنوغرافية، وقام بتحرير الأقسام الخمسة الأولى منها وقدمها للنشر إلى مطبعة غتسوك، وكان من المنتظر طباعتها في عام 1902، حتى أن عنوان هذه النشر المنتظرة تم إدراجه في فهرس إصدارات معهد لازاريف، إلا أن المادة المعدة للنشر لم يقدر لها أن ترى النور آنذاك، وذلك لسببين: لأن كريمسكي أدخل إلى آراء بعض زملائه في معهد لازاريف الذين نصحوه بإضافة الخط العربي إلى جانب النقل الصوتي للأمثال وإضافة الترجمة الفرنسية لها، وفي غضون ذلك المطبعة انتقلت إلى مكان آخر وضعت المادة المعدة للنشر كليا بلا راجعة، وبالتالي لم تنشر أبدا، إلا أن هناك دليل أن كريمسكي رجع إلى هذه المادة بعد سنوات كثيرة عندما كان يعمل في أوكرانيا، لأن هناك دفاتر في هذا الملف، توجد دفاتر منتجة في البلد السوفيتية وليس في بداية القرن العشرين، وكثير من الأوراق مطبوعة على الآلة الكاتبة، مما يدل على أن كريمسكي كان يحاول أن يعيد على الأقل بعض هذه المادة للنشر، إلا أنه لم يتسنى له ذلك في بعض الأسباب. اكتشفنا أنه لم يصل إلينا إلا جزء من هذه المادة التي جمعها. كما ذكرنا كان عدد الأمثال أكثر من 5000، وبحسب تقديرنا عدد الأمثال في الملف المتوفر لدينا لا يزيد عن 1700 مثل ونظير. هذا الملف يحتوي على أوراق كثيرة ودفاتر، وهي موجودة بشكل عشوائي نسبيا، فبعد الاطلاع عليها بانتباه اتضح أنه يمكن تقسيم هذه المادة إلى جزئين غير مترابطين. أولا الدفاتر بخط يد كريمسكي، نرى نموذجا لهذه الصفحات على هذه الصورة. هذه الدفاتر هي 5، وعدد الأمثال المراقبة بيده 1112 مثلا. أما مادة الجزء الثاني فهي عبارة عن أوراق ودفاتر مطبوعة مكتوبة بخط يد كريمسكي وأوراق مطبوعة على يد الكاتبة، وبعد المقارنة بينها اتضح أنها نفس المادة. فنرى نموذجا لنفس الصفحة مكتوبة ومطبوعة. يمكن الاعتراض أن هذه الأوراق المطبوعة على يد الكاتبة هي ما كان كريمسكي يعده للنشر وهو موجود في كييف. انتبهنا إلى إشارات متكررة بخط يد كريمسكي، حيث يذكر مجموعة مطبوعة لنون نقطة شقير. فبحثنا ووجدنا هذا الكتاب الذي استخرج منه كريمسكي هذه الأمثال، علما بأن الأمثال في الجزء الثاني من الملف ليست أمثال مدونة من ألسنة أهل لبنان، بل هي مستخرجة من منشورات صدرت في أواخر القرن ال19 كما اتضح. بحثنا ووجدنا الكتاب الذي ذكره كريمسكي، وهو بعنوان أمثال العوام في مصر والسودان والشام بقلم نعوم شقير، وقد صدر في القاهرة في سنة 1894. نرى صورة غلاف هذا الكتاب وإحدى صفحاته. يجدر بالذكر أن الأمثال التي دونها كريمسكي في الجزء الأول من الملف من ملف الأرشيف غير واردة في هذا الكتاب. أما هذه الأمثال في الجزء الثاني فهي مأخوذة من كتاب نعوم شقير. ذكر المؤلف أي نعوم شقير أنه دون هذه الأمثال من ألسنة الناس سواء في الشام، ويقصد به بيروت ولبنان، أو مصر في القاهرة والإسكندرية، أو السودان. فقسم المؤلف الأمثال في هذا الكتاب إلى 3 أبواب، أي الشامية والمصرية والسودانية. ومثلا في باب الأقسام الشامية أشار بحروف تدل على استخدام مثل معين إما في مصر أو في السودان أو في اللغة الفصحى. فمثلا حرف الصاد مقابل بعض الأمثال كما نرى على الشاشة في الجهة الشمالية. حرف الصاد يدل على أن المعطى متداول في مصر، وحرف السين يعني أنه متداول في السودان، وحرف الفاء أنه موجود في اللغة الفصحى، وحرف النون أنه خاص بكلام النساء. أما كريمسكي فلم يستخدم هذه الإشارات ولم يذكرها في كتاباته في أوراقه، فقط استخرج بعض الأمثال وحذف البعض الآخر، علما بأن عدد الأمثال في كتاب نعوم شقير هو 1435 مثلا. أما عدد الأمثال في مدونات كريمسكي بحسب تقديرنا التقريبي هو 750 في هذا الجزء الثاني من الملف، لأن في هذا الجزء من الملف الأمثال غير مرقمة، ليس لها ترقيم نظامي، فمن الصعب أن نحسبها. فكريمسكي يعني استخرج تقريبا نصف الأمثال من هذه المجموعة المطبوعة. نرى على هذه الصورة نموذج من إحدى صفحات الكتاب والصفحة المماثلة من أوراق كريمسكي، حيث نفس الأمثال مستخرجة ومطبوعة على الآلة الكاتبة. وعلما بأن المؤلف نعوم شقير لم يضيف أي تعليق إلى أمثاله، نجد فقط قائمة الأمثال. أما كريمسكي فدون هذه الأمثال عن طريق النقل الصوتي بالحروف الكيريلية، وأضاف إليها الترجمة الروسية وبعض التعليقات حول معنى استخدام هذه الأمثال. وأخيرا حتى لا أطيل عليكم، لنقرأ بعض الأمثال التي دونها كريمسكي بخط يده. سأذكر فقط المثل بالعامية حسب النطق الذي دونه كريمسكي، وباختصار التعليق الذي كتبه. بكيش دبان يقال عن إنسان كسلان. وأشار أيضا أن هناك تعبير معادل أكثر أدبا، هو شمام هوى الطاف ورد. ثم شيء بدور بالقلب يقال عن الشيء الممل. ثم عيش يقديش يطلع الحشيش، ويضاف أحيانا تاكل وتعيش. ذكر كريمسكي أنه سمع هذا المثل في الموقف التالي: قال طالب الطب نجيب شهوري لحضورهم أنه يأمل في اكتساب دخل جيد عندما يموت جيل الأطباء الكبار في الصين في بيروت ويحل هو محله. فأجابه أحد بهذا المثل وهو يقصد أن المستقبل غير مضمون وأنه قد يموت قبله. وشه ما بيضحك لرغيف السخن يقال عن إنسان عابس لا يضحك لأي شيء. برد مثل المغيث يقال عن مكان بارد جدا. أشار كريمسكي أن المغيث بالعامية هي منطقة جبلية في طريق دمشق ما بين زحل والصوفر، مشهورة ببرودة مناخها. والتعبير الروسي المعادل هو مثل برد سيبيري. والشيء الذي لفت نظرنا عند الاطلاع على هذه المجموعة هذه الدفاتر أن كريمسكي عند استخدامه الخط العربي دون المثل بطريقة فصيحة لا غير. أما عند النقل الصوتي بالحروف الكريلية فدونه فقط بالعامية بطريقة أكاديمية دقيقة. وأرجو من الدكتور أولكسي خامراي أن يتحدث في هذا الموضوع بمزيد من التفصيل، لأنه يهتم بموضوع النقل الصوتي الأكاديمي من اللغة العربية من زمان، وعنده بعض الملاحظات والاستنتاجات في هذا الموضوع. وشكرا.
ثم أرجوك أن تتواصل شيء هذا، وأنا سأقول أي صورة. يعني نرى دفتر من الدفاتر لهذه المجموعة في شكله الأصلي. يعني نرى الأمثال النص مكتوب بالحروف العربية، وهنا نفس المثل بالنقل الصوتي، وربما صورة ثانية. نعم، هنا نفس الشيء ولكن في واحد من 4 خيارات، يعني بالحروف العربية بالنقل الصوتي، بعد ذلك من نقل الصوت 3 فقط في الحروف العربية بالنقل الصوتي، وبالنقل الصوتي ولكن مطبوعة على آلة الطبع. بلا شك كريمسكي صاحب الفاضل ليس في تسجيل وجمع والى اخره لهذه الامثال، ولكن هو من احد المؤلفين نظام النقل الصوتي او العملي، هذا يتعلق باستخدامه. وهنا نقدر أن نرى في جزء يعني القطاع الرابع نقدر أن نرى عدد من الحروف غريبة، مثلا حرف L. لماذا ما تابع كريمسكي هذا الحرف بآلة الكتابة؟ ربما إذا نرى الصورة القادمة بعد ربما نعم في الجزء الأعلى نرى ماذا كتب كريمسكي باللغة الأوكرانية. هذا مهم جدا لأن في أواخر القرن ال19 وأوائل القرن ال20 كتب بالروسية طبعا. هذا المخطوط كتب كريمسكي أظن في منتصف العشرينات والثلاثينات. في هذا الزمان اللغة الأوكرانية بدأت لغة رسمية في أكاديمية العلوم وكريمسكي استعمل بها. يبدو كريمسكي عن تاريخ عمله الذي بدأه في 1896 وإلى آخره. له كان اهتمام كبير لنقل صوتي مثلا للحرف الصوت ل. يكتب كريمسكي أن هذا الصوت ليس صوت الإمالة وليس صوت التفخيم، يعني لا ال ولا هو، وشيء متوسط، شيء بين هذه الصوتين، ويقترح حرف لتسجيله. الحرف نرى هنا ونرى ربما يولا ترجع القادمة. نعم نرى هنا استخدام هذا الحرف يعني لنقل صوتي لصوت كما سمعه كريمسكي في بيروت. لا أدري لماذا عمل بهذه الطريقة، ولكن نرى هنا رغم وجود الحرف لا في مجموعة حروف الآلة الكاتبة، هو يستخدم بشكل مستمر هذا الحرف. يعني هو أحد مؤلفين نظام النقل الصوتي على أساس مجموعة حروف سيريلية أو كيريلية. القادمة نعم. وهنا نرى الوضع الحقيقي في هذه مسجلات. يستخدم كريمسكي الحروف السيريلية والحروف العربية والحروف من نظام من مجموعة الذي طرحه كريمسكي. وبعد ذلك نرى أيضا الترجمة الفرنسية. يعني أعطى كريمسكي كل الإمكانيات لكل يريد أن يفهم معنى وشكل وإلى آخره أن يعمل ذلك للتنفيذ عملية الفهم وربما استخدام آخر. وبعد ذلك يوجد سلسلة عمل كريمسكي لأيامنا هذه. مثلا يوجد صعوبات النقل العملي للأسماء العربية أصلا، مثلا أو الأسماء العربية أسماء العرب من قبل السلطات الأوكرانية. عندما يستلموا مستندات مكتوبة فيها أي أسماء شخصية أو أسماء جغرافية مثلا، دائما موجود احتمال الغرب. وكريمسكي أسس قواعد النقل الصوتي الذي يستعملون الآن، نستعملها اليوم. يعني كريمسكي ليس واحد من المؤلفي الماضي علماء الماضي، ولكن لعمل لبحوث كريمسكي أهمية حتى اليوم. وشكرا.
شكرا لك دكتور حمراي وشكرا لك دكتورة بيتروفا. Now we can invite our next speaker, His Excellency Ihor Ostash. No. I want to present you well. So Ihor Ostash is a Ukrainian ambassador in the Lebanese Republic. He received his Ph.D. in 1986 at the Institute of Linguistics, Ukrainian National Academy of Science. From 1991 to 1994, he worked as a head of the International School of Ukrainian Studies. Later on, he served as a member of the Ukrainian Parliament and as a diplomat. His primary area of research was focused on Slavic studies, but now his academic interests are related to Ukrainian-Lebanese historical and cultural connections.
Thank you very much.
Ihor Ostash, His Excellency, will present a paper on the book printing in Lebanon in 17th and 18th century from the lens of works of Ahatanhel Krymskyi.
Exactly. Oops. Okay. Yes, you can also turn it. Okay. Thank you. Ahatanhel Krymskyi on book printing in Syria and Lebanon, 17th, 18th centuries. The period of 17th and early 18th centuries was a kind of prelude to the Arab Renaissance of the 19th century that started in Egypt and then spread to Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and other Arab countries. An important element of this process was the beginning of Arabic printing. According to many researchers, the introduction of printing in Syria and Lebanon had significant consequences for the national and literary revival of these peoples. The first book in Lebanon was published in 1610 in the monastery of St. Anthony in Korskaya. It was the Book of Psalms, a small folio of 260 pages in two languages, Syriac and Karshuni, Arabic printed in Syriac. In the history of new Arabic literature, Ahatanhel Krymskyi describes the activities of printing houses in Aleppo, modern Syria, 1706-1711, and Shweir, modern Lebanon, 1733-1889. The Ukrainian Orientalist also determines the preconditions that led to the creation of the first printing house in the Middle East in the Maronite monastery of St. Anthony in northern Lebanon. The first printing house in modern Lebanon was founded in the Maronite monastery with a considerable support from Apostolic See. The founder of the printing house was Sarkis Arrizzi, a former student of the Maronite College in Rome. He bought a printing press at the embassy in Italy, and he also worked on the publication of 3-volume Arabic Bible published in Rome in 1671. Ahatanhel Krymskyi mentions in his book that a significant cultural event, not only for the Maronite Arabs, but of course for the whole Lebanon, was the establishment at Apostolic See in Rome in 1584, a special Maronite college or collegium, where Maronite talented youths were sent to study as scholars in order to prepare for their homeland and increase the number of European educated clergy in Lebanon, as well as priests and bishops. Some of the pupils of Roman Maronite maybe I will switch to the next episode. It's the Orthodox printing house in Aleppo. I already mentioned that in previous presentation. Ahatanhel Krymskyi tells about the history of the printing house in Aleppo in 1706 through the perspective of the biography of Abdallah Zahir, the founder of the printing house in the monastery of St. John at Shweir. At his native Halep, the first Orthodox Arabic printing house was founded by Athanasius, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Antiochia, from the first years of 18th century, with the material support of Brankovian, the Wallachian ruler, and Ivan Mazepa, the Ukrainian hetman ruler, that is mentioned in the first books of this printing house in Psalms and Gospels. Maybe I will also leave these pages because it's about Aleppo, about Gospels. And second episode, it will be the print house in the Melkite Monastery in Shweir, Lebanon. Krymskyi describes the history of the conflict between the Orthodox and the Uniats in Aleppo, noting that from 1720s, the Orthodox part of the Lebanese Christians began to move en masse to the union with Catholic Rome, refusing, like the Halepes, from the power of Greek Damascus Patriarch. In this story of the schism, Krymskyi presents the conflict situation around Abdallah Zahir. He mentioned that in the 1720s, when the Aleppo Orthodox Arabs, through oppression by the higher Greek clergy, showed a mass drive for union with Rome, Abdallah Zahir, with the rank of deacon, took an active part in the struggle against the Greeks. Due to the deacon's controversy with the Orthodox Church, the Greek clergy managed to present him to the Ottoman government in Constantinople as a politically unreliable man and to obtain a sultan's decree on his execution. And Abdallah Zahir then had escaped from Aleppo to safe Lebanon, to the monastery of St. John and Shweir, Marijohana, where his brother Nicholas was an abbot. Then I will quote also Krymskyi about the publications in Shweir. Krymskyi also marks the high demand for the publication of Psalms of 1735 as very little for other Shweir editions. The book of this kind, Psalms, quickly found demand among Arab families, even far from Catholicism, so that the publication was repeated many times and brought material income to the monastery. However, other printed publications of Shweir Monastery were not so successful. There were a few, some 24 during the 18th century, and by the content there were the translations of all sorts of Jesuit mystical and ascetic considerations about the futility of the word and in its sinfulness, etc. This is also proved that by the fact that Psalms themselves were reprinted in Shweir for 15 times. And one more episode, it's printing house in Beirut. And Ivana Feodorov had very substantial research of this printing house. Another printing house in Lebanon began its activities in 1755 in Beirut at the Church of St. George Monastery. Beirut became the intellectual Orthodox capital in the middle of the 18th century. Famous figures worked there. Among them, there are Ioanniki, the Cypriot metropolitan, Makarius Sadaka from Tripoli, the deacon Theodosius Halabi, the book printer, polemist, writer, and teacher Yusuf Mark. And these people came to Beirut from other cities. And at that time, Beirut was far superior to Damascus, the capital of the Patriarchate and its intellectual potential. Yusuf Mark was a Syrian scholar of Sylvester, the patriarch of Antioch, who worked in the workshop of the monastery of San Spiridon in Bucharest, 1747-1750. After returning from Romania, he organized and managed the first Orthodox printing house in Lebanon in the parish house of the Church of St. George Monastery. We also learn about this episode in the history of book printing from Beirut Church Chronicle of the 16th-18th centuries, where this period is described. At that time, Yusuf Mark, a very educated book lover, polemicist, and priest from Tripoli, worked in the city. He opened a flourishing, beautiful school with verbal and theological sciences. I'd like to express my gratitude to Yulia Petrova, if she is here, because she made also very substantial research on this Beirut Church Chronicle of 16th, 18th century. Thank you very much, Yulia. And I'd like to finish with Ioana Feodorou, another our colleague. She assumes a Bucharest trace in the organization of the first printing house in Beirut, namely in the origin of the Arabic fonts used in the printing house. She doubts the idea that the letters were created on the model of the fonts of the printing house of St. John Monastery in Shweir, referring to the correspondence between Musa Trabulsi and Yusuf Mark. In it, he announced before Easter 1749 that he was completing the production of new Arabic font and would begin casting letters after the holidays. Ioana Feodorou also notes that the founder of the printed house, Yusuf Mark, who lived in Bucharest for 3 years, could bring with him to Beirut the necessary material and letters which could be basis for the production of Arabic fonts in Beirut. Okay, unfortunately, I'm out of time, and I'd like to thank you for attention, and I hope that maybe we'll try to talk about it later, okay?
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, Your Excellency, and now we have the last presentation in this panel. It will be presented by Stanislav Litvinov, who is a Ph.D. student at Kyiv National Karpenko-Karey Theater, Cinema and Television University. The topic of his Ph.D. research is Lebanese cinema, genesis, development, integration into the world cinematography process. During 2018-2020, he worked with the ambassador of Ukraine in Lebanon, Ihor Ostash, on the film Ukrainian Lebanon, which premiered in Lebanon in 2020. And his passion for Lebanese culture in cinema determined his scientific focus in Ukraine. He believes that cinema is a powerful instrument of cultural diplomacy, and it is the priority of his research now. Stanislav will present a paper about history of Lebanese cinematography through the lens of Ahatanhel Krymskyi's letters.
Good afternoon, dear participants of this conference. My name is Stanislav Litvinov, and I have the honor to be the part of this event, which is devoted to the name of Ahatanhel Krymskyi, one of the most prominent Orientalists in the world. The topic of my report is a scientific procession of the letters of Ahatanhel Krymskyi in the study of the history of Lebanese cinematography, 1897. When I first visited Lebanon in the spring of 2018, together with His Excellency Ambassador Ihor Ostash, we were working on the film Ukrainian Lebanon. I fell in love with Lebanon from the first days of my stay, which is why I decided to write the dissertation on Lebanese cinema. I became the first researcher on this topic in Ukraine. When I started researching the history of cinema in Lebanon, I decided to start with the filmography of the Lumiere brothers, hoping to find the first films shot in Lebanon, and this search was successful. I managed to find a series of films called Alexander Premio in Turkey, 1897. This raw panoramas of Oleksiy Khamray. It allowed us to follow the path of the French director Oleksiy Khamray, who worked for the Lumière brothers with a film camera in the Middle East. The collection of 24 films signed by Khamray on reels as Tukidesi contains 2 documentaries made in Beirut. Both are dated on the 3rd of April in 1897. I want to understand why Oleksiy Khamray has chosen this path to Damascus in April. So I decided to turn to the works of Ukrainian scientist and Orientalist Ahatanhel Krymskyi, who had been in Beirut at the time. It is thanks to him that we can understand the surrounding atmosphere that was in Lebanon at the time. These observations are extremely important for film critics because deciphering the documentary footage of these first films, we try to understand the historical context of the filmed materials and analyze the choice of footage of the patriarchs of cinema. So the first film in the Lumière Brothers catalog is number 410 and is called Place des Canons. In the description, library bathroom in the square in Beirut. The film was taken on one of the central squares of the Lebanese capital, Canon Square, now Market Square. Today there is one negative copy, duration 1 minute. I suggest the conference participants watch the first film shot in Lebanon.
Скажи, що у нас не йде, може він не знає?
It's frozen. We cannot see.
It's not playing.
No, it's not playing.
Станіслав, не запускається. Не запускається.
Я вас чую.
У нас замовлення.
Не працюємо. Давайте, якщо зараз ще раз спробуємо так, якщо не вийде, тоді я... Зараз видно?
Ну так.
Є відео, так?
Є.
О.
First film.
Oh, inside Ahatanhel Krymskyi inside. Yes. The cap. Sheikh Jamal.
Beirut, 1897.
1897, yes.
Time of Ahatanhel Krymskyi. He was walking around.
This is exactly how Ahatanhel Krymskyi saw Beirut. After all, it was at the time that he lived in Beirut. In his letter to his father, number 60 in the book, Letters from Syria and Lebanon, 1896-1898, dated on the birth, on the 10th of April in 1897, Ahatanhel Krymskyi wrote, "Now it's just paradise. Burning wind is over, and the weather is exactly like ours in July. It is worth watching from any side or balcony. Beirut is drowning in the greenery of gardens, meadows, and fields. The most tender trees are blooming and others are already bare bearing fruit. It shows that the weather conditions were the most favorable for the trip of the studio operator Lumiere to Lebanon. Alexander Krymskyi's second film, number 411, is entitled Saul Abul El Nassar. One moment. Видно субтитр?
Видно, да, видно.
Чудово. In the description circulation in the market, it was filmed at the Abu El Nassar market in Beirut. The director documented pedestrian traffic at the market. The catalog lists 2 live negative copies. Unfortunately, the digital version of the film is not yet freely available, but I hope that the Lumiere Brothers Archives provides a digital copy for my research. However, we have a still image that gives an idea of that shooting. It's interesting thing that Alexander Krymskyi, in his filming of Lebanon, preferred people's lives rather than landscapes and monuments. Ahatanhel Krymskyi also paid attention to Beirut sellers, describing them as follows. Certainly, here in Beirut, everyone is either a big seller or a shopkeeper. Many of them are both smart and cute. I live perfectly with them. There are also a lot of decent and intelligent people. So we conclude from this that is a special ability of the people of Beirut to trade since Phoenician times attracted the attention of documentary filmmaker Alexander Krymskyi and our famous Orientalist Ahatanhel Krymskyi. If we consider these letters in the context of modern documentary production, we can understand that they are the most accurate authors. The text which was written in this silent film. The works of Ahatanhel Krymskyi can be qualified as the scientific shows expanded that are sources of the history of the Lebanese cinema. Summarizing all that has been said, the above mentioned films from the Lumiere Brothers Film Library may be useful in the research of Orientalist ethnography of Lebanese history and the late 19th century, and especially the ethnographic research of Ahatanhel Krymskyi during his stay in Beirut in 1897. Thank you for attention.
Фільм зараз буде. Зараз буде фільм. To our thanks to Stanislav Litvinov, and now it's really a unique presentation because it's about first image of Beirut in cinematograph. But now we will look into in one more image of Beirut. It will be extraction from the film Ukrainian Lebanon, and Stanislav Litvinov, who just finished his presentation, is the producer of this film, director of this film. But I should say a couple of words as introduction to this short presentation about Ahatanhel Krymskyi in Lebanon. We made shooting of this film in Rmeili. It's not far from here, actually, where Ahatanhel Krymskyi used to live in Beirut. And just after this shooting, it was unbelievable story. Beirut blast, and this area was very seriously damaged, destroyed, and it's about this tragedy and Hopefully you will see at least part of Rmeili in good condition before the blast. Нема фільму? О. Okay, it looks like there is no chance now to watch it because it's technically there is a problem. We will watch it right after lunch, okay? With very good, strong new opportunities.
We will have 40 minutes of lunch, so we're supposed to be back at 2, let's say at 2:45. Okay? Yes, so.
Bon appétit.
Bon appétit.